Yes.
No, Dave, that's impossible. Dave, 3,000 calories is significantly more than like the amount the average person consumes.
Yes,
per day.
I know. 2 burgers, a double shack burger.
That makes no sense.
Dave.
Double shack burger calories.
Okay, look how many calories in it.
Dave, this is extremely unhealthy.
Ladies and gentlemen, we bring you to an outdoor edition of Keep It a Buck, a backyard edition, if you will.
Something like that. We checked out a couple of different locations, but we settled in here. Dave,
Yeah.
I think it's treating us nicely so far.
I mean, it's pretty breezy over. It was almost
hot.
Yeah, it was like wildfire conditions a little bit further back.
Yeah.
It's nicer here. Yevgeny Prigozhin is dead.
So that's one way to jump into it. Yeah, sources, our personal Keep It a Buck sources have reached out to us, and we've been informed that the militia leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has been part of an airplane crash that killed, I believe, about 10 other passengers.
Yes.
Or maybe 10 passengers, including himself.
Mm-hmm.
It's not fully confirmed yet, but that's just what sources are saying.
He was on the passenger list.
Yeah, he was on the passenger list. Maybe he was very perspicacious and he decided to stay at home that day. I guess only time will tell. But our sources also confirmed that our President Joseph Biden has already been briefed on the matter. And we hope he was informed and received it well.
I think we can assume that Vladimir Putin is the man to blame for this attack.
Yeah.
Though this is developing, within the past 30 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's done it before. He tried to kill Navalny. He poisoned other people who, got in his path.
I mean, his kill list by now is in the hundreds, minimum. At least in this case, Prigozhin didn't just stumble out of a window or get some bad food poisoning. That's a little...
What's his KD ratio? What's Putin's KD?
It has to be excellent. But, no, so... I don't know. I mean, it's clear. We've talked about this before. Prigozhin has, in the past, attempted to...
Well, he started marching on Moscow.
Yeah, he was marching on Moscow. He was almost making a foolery out of Putin. He was saying that the current Russian army is in the shambles. They're totally unorganized. They're not intelligent.
Which is true.
It's true. But when you're dealing with Vladimir Putin, he's not very receptive to criticism.
With Vladdy.
Yeah, he's not receptive to constructive criticism, clearly. And the punishment that Yevgeny received was to go on exile in Belarus. And it's funny, I think even on the podcast when we talked about it, we were kind of saying like, wow, it's kind of a weak move from Putin. Like he's done a lot more for a lot less,
yeah.
In terms of punishment. And here he goes, go off scot-free, go enjoy yourself in Belarus, and then maybe you sneak your way back to St. Petersburg in a couple of weeks.
I think he knew what he was doing. He was just waiting for the right moment.
Exactly. But I'm just saying, like, it's funny the way that like that narrative switches just like that. Yeah, so where was this plane going? I think it was going to St. Petersburg, actually.
Yes, it was over a Russian territory that it crashed.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe he thought...
We don't know how the crash happened. This is within the last 30 minutes this happened. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Putin he shows again he's crazy, power hungry, I guess. But I don't know. I mean, it's just to me it's insane that we're just watching all of this be so public and it's so clear what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, when Dave and I found out, we were on the floor.
No, it was stunning because Prigozhin himself is a billionaire. Yeah.
Well, he's an oligarch.
Yeah, one of the most powerful men in Russia. During like the height of the Ukraine war, he was absolutely invaluable to Putin. He's one of his closest friends, and well, I don't know if friends is the right word, but very very close business partners, whatever you want to say. And unfortunately, he got caught up in an accident, and we'll see as the story develops. But
it's a shame.
Closing thoughts on that.
It's a shame. I mean, look, it's. I don't think a man like this can stay in power for much longer. He can't keep acting like this. It'll definitely catch up to him. And
our President Joseph will probably.
He'll straighten it out.
He'll intervene as he does. Yeah, but speaking of Joseph Biden, he made his way to Maui today, I believe.
Really, for the
Yeah, or at the very least, he was having some kinds of Maui-related business meetings.
so I think that everyone. Let's very shake a table. I think everyone at this point has probably heard about the disaster, what happened on Hawaii, the wildfire that started. At one point, journalists weren't even allowed in to investigate the cause of the wildfire. I mean, the first thing, obviously, before you start worrying about how it happened, is
Why it happened?
yeah, why it happened.
Oh, yeah.
Is like try to contain it. The Red Cross gets involved. CVS starts asking me to round up my change.
Mhm.
But yeah, so I heard through the grapevine that a lot of times, how wildfires break out, and in fact, what might have happened here, is that it's old electrical infrastructure that sparks and surrounded by dry brush, and that sets off a chain fire in a small area, and then it spreads into cities.
Right. For me, I really don't like the way that the government of Maui is handling this, in the sense of completely blocking out journalists from being within some like crazy like radius of where everything is going on. It's not transparent. We don't know how many people were affected.
That's something Putin would do.
I know. I mean, it's very unclear how the situation is being navigated and handled there. This is being kept very hush-hush. And a lot of people and journalists, rightfully so, are wondering, is there something that's being covered up here? Is it maybe not as natural as we're giving it credit to be?
Yeah, I mean, I have my suspicion on that it was the spark. And what's interesting is the company that's said to have set off the spark was flaunting how heavily they were investing in renewable energy to combat climate change. And then, I mean, look, obviously this wasn't their intention, but because this infrastructure wasn't properly maintained, we did have this wildfire. What's interesting is there have been a lot of wildfires recently. There aren't necessarily more wildfires in terms of frequency since dating back 2-3 decades ago. What we do see is they take up a larger area, so they affect more people. They spread faster due to certain climate conditions that allow the fuel for the fire to become more available.
Yeah,
with dry brush and stuff like that.
Gotcha. Yeah, so, I mean, whichever way it was that it spread, it's absolutely devastating. And I brought up how Biden visited. I have actually a quote from something that he brought up today. He's actually catching a little bit of flack from it. A lot of people are saying...
A bit of what?
A bit of flack for the comments that he made. People are saying it's a bit tone deaf. It's being proclaimed, the visit, as a photo op. So the comments that he made was... He said, "I don't want to compare difficulties, but we have a little sense, Jill and I, of what it was like to lose a home. Years ago now, 15 years, I was in Washington doing Meet the Press. Lightning struck at home on a little lake outside the home. Not a lake, a big pond. It hit the wire and came up underneath our home into the air-conditioned ducts. To make a long story short, I almost lost my wife, my 67 Corvette, and my cat."
He actually said that?
Yeah. I mean, at least in my opinion, I think that's not very sensitive to the kinds of tragedies that are occurring in Maui, and it feels like a very false equivalency.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, look, stepping away from that, I wonder how these wildfires can be prevented in the future.
Right.
We were affected personally in New York with what happened in Canada.
Yeah.
And we just see how how truly destructive these things can be, especially to people who are more sensitive to that type of poor air quality. But I think it comes down to, updating this old electrical infrastructure, and I guess different policies that are put in place. I know a lot of politicians like to speak about they use these wildfires as a talking point, like for climate change, and to push those policies. I don't know if that's the right approach for it, especially since it affects people so personally, and it's not necessary. It's more so, I guess, like man-made indirectly. It's because of the things that aren't properly maintained, areas that aren't,
And even putting aside how to prevent them, it's also how do we respond to them that clearly, I think, needs sharpening.
It's unorganized.
It's extremely unorganized. I think if you're in an area where you're going to be susceptible to wildfires, you need to have those evacuation plans set. You need to have shelters in place right away. Like it should not be this wild scramble. And I think I don't know. I mean, it seems like there's been a lot of attempts to profit off of it as well. Even within Maui, I know. I just want to pull up the article.
Profit off the wildfires, you mean?
In terms of, so there were businesses that were the most important thing in Maui, and I'm assuming in Hawaii in general, is water. Yeah, so what's been going on in Maui is actually something that's being referred to as plantation disaster capitalism. That's a term that's being used, and I'll just read directly from the Guardian's article about this. They say there are real estate agents who have been cold calling Lahaina residents who have lost everything to the fire and prodding them to sell their ancestral lands rather than wait for compensation. But it also places these moves inside the long and ongoing history of settler colonial resource theft and trickery, making it clear that while disaster capitalism might have some modern disguises, it's a very old tactic. And we know there, of course, has been a lot of exploitation in relationship to water in Maui for a while, where corporations have been using a ton of water, golf courses, and there's a big question of the equity in terms of how the water is being distributed.
Interesting. So it looks like water's a
hot commodity.
Yeah.
So to speak. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's something that doesn't honestly come to mind first when
because it's so accessible.
Exactly. For us here, it's so accessible, but there, that's the most valuable resource that they have. And it seems like it's always been that way. Fights over whose water belongs to who.
Yeah. I never thought about it that way. Well, look, I mean, our hearts go out to everyone who was, affected, who knows anyone who was affected. Let's pivot a little bit to what's happening in New York. Less severe issue. We know that marijuana was legalized in New York a while ago, and now there's been a hold put on cannabis dispensaries in terms of their licenses. So a minority group that's mainly composed of veterans and a few other groups whose names escape me. But basically, they were saying that these licenses weren't properly allocated, and they only allowed a certain group of people to get their hands on these licenses, and a judge put their distribution on hold. I mean, how do you see that affecting New York on a whole? So
you're saying that cannabis dispensaries basically are losing their licenses, they're no longer able
So here's the thing, the ones that were issued are fine, and new ones, the issuance of new ones has been put on hold.
Right. Well, I mean, to be honest, I don't know how much of a difference it will make. Maybe it'll lessen the competition. It might drive prices higher. There's definitely still a market for it. I'm not sure actually the impact that dispensaries have had on the illegal underground type market. It's another thing to think about. Maybe it helps that the underground side out of it.
So here's the thing: cannabis usage has increased. So
makes sense.
From my understanding, the dispensaries have more so added a new type of user, maybe converted some, but the underground ring I think is still
it's definitely still active. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. Do you know the reason behind why they've been declining
the permits?
Yeah.
So, I mean, the licenses, rather. So what happened was a group started protesting and saying that it's a very narrow group of people who are allowed to receive the permits to sell, to open up a cannabis dispensary, and they wanted it to be a wider group of people. Granted, the permits will still come back. I think what's interesting is that New York isn't responsible for the growth of a lot of cannabis. It mainly centers in, California, Nevada, Colorado, some farms in Michigan. So New York isn't. It's still very new on the scene. So for a lot of people, this is, I guess, a shock to them. People who really hope that this would become more of a market in New York. In terms of like farms opening up, stuff like that being legalized, this puts a bigger hold on that.
Right. I mean, I think cannabis in general, I know that there was a lot more hype for the industry coming into even around the pandemic, but essentially like around President Biden's election. I remember when he was elected president, there was a ton of hype around a lot of different cannabis stocks and ETFs, which have since fallen off quite a bit. I don't know. I mean, I think it's here to stay, of course. I'm not sure, honestly, about the reasoning behind why it's gotten to be such an exclusive club of which dispensaries can sell and which can't. But I don't know. I mean, maybe we'll start to see some sort of consolidation in the industry and start seeing like huge dispensary companies that appear nationwide, like monopoly type situations.
Interesting. What do you think about dispensaries that open up in touristic areas of the city?
Yeah, so that's, I think, actually, for a lot of people, it's a big problem. Even aside from city areas, I think in general, nobody really wants to live next to cannabis farms as well. So that, I mean, it's on both sides. It's both in the production and where they're being sold.
And we were talking to the professor about that too. He said that that's someone next to him,
yeah, in his home in Vermont, was it?
Yeah.
So it's a big deal. It's a similar issue that I think people have with affordable housing being built in like wealthier areas, where it affects the price of real estate. I don't know. Maybe it affects quality of life for people around the dispensary, and it probably also affects the value of their homes.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. It's still developing in a lot of ways. It's not as regulated as it as it will be. But yeah, I think that's a lot of stuff has happened during a roundtable. India landed on the moon, not a person, an unmanned aircraft.
Yeah, and I want to bring up UPS actually as our company of the week for this week. So while I was away and while we went on hiatus a little bit with the podcast, UPS was actually able to avoid a very big strike, and they've been able to come to an agreement with their union, which represents about 340,000 workers.
Whoa.
And the idea, these are numbers given from UPS, is that total comp, including benefits, for UPS workers will be able to reach about $170,000.
Wow.
Or not for like maybe entry level, but if you've spent some time there, at the end of they give 5-year contracts now. And I think by the end of the contract, they're going to make about that much. I'll just read to you. So under the tentative agreement, full and part-time union workers will get $2.75 more per hour in 2023, and $7.50 more by the end of the 5-year contract.
That's a noticeable
Starting
difference.
Hourly pay for part-time employees gets bumped up to $21.
Here's the thing. I can't say I have a huge issue with that. I mean, supply chains have been, just zooming out a little bit, they've been in a very delicate place since COVID.
Yeah.
We had a huge shortage of truck drivers. We still do have a huge shortage of truck drivers. I spoke to a guy recently, last month. He said he drove a lot around America. He was an owner-operator, had his own truck. I said, why'd you quit? He said it didn't pay.
Right.
He could drive for Uber a few times a week and make as much. It doesn't make sense. I think it's even a good thing that they're doing this. If they were to go on strike, it would be
disastrous.
It would be absolutely disastrous. UPS has a reputation to uphold. They wanted to handle the situation well. And look, it'll just make them a more enticing place to work at. Considering that fiscally they can handle something like this, that they can afford to pay their workers more, I think it'll come back to them. It'll pay itself back. Happier workers, more efficient deliveries, more people wanting to come onto the job. I think it's amazing that they could even do something like that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it was a smart move, both business-wise and just for public image. I mean, you want to make sure that your workers are being fairly compensated. And truck drivers, UPS in general, they're the lifeblood of a lot of businesses. People hugely rely on them to get the deliveries in on time. I think it was a smart move. And one more thing, just quickly. We've talked before about investment in various cities. And I remember in New York, we were talking a little bit about some of the problems behind having businesses in New York. It was more prevalent in Chicago. But interestingly enough, New York has lost $1 trillion in Wall Street businesses as firms flee the city. Nearly 160 Wall Street firms have moved their headquarters out of New York since the end of 2019.
Whoa. So, and they typically move to Florida.
Yeah, I mean, they're moving to a lot of places. Some of them are moving to, like, even internationally. I'm seeing Argentina. Wait. The government of Argentina moved their headquarters to West Palm Beach, Florida.
The government of Argentina?
Yeah, from New York. So
interesting. I mean, it's expected. A lot of people are not running, but sprinting away from the city. I mean, in terms of the rate of taxes, the amount of crime that we see. What?
I have a correction.
Tell me.
Hedge fund tycoon Paul Singer's Elliott Management, which oversees $59 billion, after shaking up investment targets, including AT&T, Twitter, and the government of Argentina. They're the ones who moved to Palm Beach.
Oh, okay. So it's not the government of Argentina.
Not directly.
Okay, they moved their headquarters.
Yeah.
I mean, look, a lot of these companies,
Florida, Texas.
even if they move their headquarters, they still have people who work in different cities, you know, and who are still paying taxes there. But yeah, in general, the migration from the city is not a new thing, and I think it'll continue happening.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, Eric Adams is in Israel, actually.
Really?
Yes. And he wants to ban wood-burning pizza ovens to protect the environment.
Very good.
Submissions.
ESG. I'm glad that we're...
Eric Adams definitely listened to the podcast.
I hope you did. But yeah, and kind of another thing that needs to be considered, not only are we losing jobs here, the tax revenue that we're losing is huge as well. New York's share of financial industry jobs was 17.6% in 2022, which is down by nearly a third from 1990. Jobs are shifting to lower cost regions, like Texas, like Florida. Even Goldman Sachs heavily investing into Dallas recently. So, yeah, I mean, it's going to be a big blow to the economy. I think the impacts of it are maybe we're not going to see right now, but when we look 10, 20 years down the line, I think it'll
when we look back,
yeah,
it's a huge transitionary period. 100%.
Right. So I think that's all that we had planned for the roundtable today. We talked about Prigozhin, huge story, breaking news. Maui, another big story, and a few other things around the edges. Cannabis industry, what's going on in New York, business-wise.
India on the moon.
India has...
We haven't heard a lot about India recently. You know,
I know.
They're laying low.
I know. Maybe they heard about our podcast on Mexico being the new China, and they decided they need to step their game up a little bit. Show us where they belong in that conversation. And yeah, thanks guys for watching. See you next episode.
See ya.